I am here today with award-winning journalist Andrew Klavan, and we are discussing his new book, The Truth and Beauty: How the Lives and Works of England's Greatest Poets Point the Way to a Deeper Understanding of the Words of Jesus. I was an English major, so it's always fun to sort of, go back and read about the Romantics and then also to parallel that with the words of Jesus Christ. So let's jump right in and tell me why you wrote this book.
Well, it really started in a conversation I was having with my son when I was saying to him that there were a lot of things in the Gospels that didn't actually make sense to me. They didn't make any practical sense, and they didn't entirely make moral sense. I mean, there are things that we are so used to thinking of as good, like turn the other cheek and love your enemies. But when I thought about them, I thought, do I really want to do that? Is that really something I even aspire to? If somebody struck me, wouldn't I strike him back? And certainly if someone struck any of the people I love, I wouldn't hesitate to strike back. And so I started to think, the more I thought about it, the more I thought, this is a little blurry. I feel like every time I understand what Jesus is saying, I get happier. I get more joyful. My life goes better. I get more serene. And yet some of it is simply, in all honesty, not making sense. And my son, who's a very brilliant guy, he's an Oxford doctorate in classics. He's very thoughtful about all these issues. He turned to me and he said, well, I think the problem is you're trying to understand a philosophy instead of trying to get to know a person. And the minute I heard that, I thought that is actually absolutely right, because only when you really know somebody do you understand the subtleties of what they're saying, and you understand where they're coming from, when they're joking, when they're trying to be a little bit sarcastic or ironic. All of those things you only get to know when you can see somebody actually practically. So I decided to go back to the Gospels and start from scratch. Forget about anything that St. Paul had said, forget about anything that the theologians said, forget about the traditions of the church, and just read it as to get to know Jesus. And I taught myself Greek, which was not very easy. I wasn't very good at it, but at least I could start to read it in the language, the oldest language we have. And as I was reading it, what kept coming back into my mind were the poems of the Romantics, guys like Wordsworth and Keats and Coleridge. I kept hearing a kind of an echo of those. And I thought, why is that? And I went back to those poems, which I love so much and I've studied all my life. And I realized there was a reason for it. The Romantic period was very much like our period. It was a period when faith started to fail. It was a period when radical politics were on the rise, a period when people started questioning gender roles and the efficacy of marriage. All of those things, and all of those things centered on a growing sense of unbelief, a growing sense of atheism in the world. When you lose touch with God, it becomes harder and harder to know what's true, what's right, and who you are. Those are all things that we depend upon God to sort of give us a ground floor on. And so these poets started to write poetry in that world, and their reaction to that world started to recreate some of the faith that had gone out of the world, some of the Christian attitudes that had gone out of the world, and did it in such beautiful poetic language that it really sticks in your head and really changes the way you read the Gospels. You go back to the Gospels after reading the poetry, and the Gospels kind of come to life in a new way. They say Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and that's true, but we're not. Our situation changes, our world changes, our consciousness changes. And I felt like these poets were speaking in a modern way about this ancient wisdom, that it was kind of like a bridge that was connecting me to Jesus Christ directly, and helping me to get to know how he saw things, not just what he said, how he saw things. And that just changed the way I read the Gospels entirely.
Well, what was so interesting to me is these poets were not all men of faith. Some of them, and you highlight this, were extremely troubled. They dealt with sickness, they dealt with depression, they dealt with mental illness. So it's so interesting to me that these very fallible human beings can still shed light on the Gospels.
Yeah, especially I think Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was maybe the most troubled. He was a drug addict. He was just he never really became what he should have been. He was a brilliant man, by far, not just the smartest of the poets, but he was one of the smartest people who ever lived. He was in the last period in time when you could actually know everything, before science just created so much information that no one person could know everything. And Coleridge did know everything. And of all of them, he was the one guy who really was a faithful Christian. He changed his attitudes of Christianity, had different kinds of Christianity, but he always came back to it, and he was always inspired by it. And Coleridge appears kind of like a spirit in all of their lives. In every single, I cover mostly these three poets, Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Keats, but I also talk about Mary Shelley, who wrote the novel Frankenstein, and what she had to say about women in a scientific age. And each of these people were deeply affected by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He talked ceaselessly. He never stopped talking. And everybody he talked to was changed by the things he said. So he collaborated with Wordsworth in Wordsworth's first great book of poetry and changed Wordsworth entirely. And Wordsworth ultimately became a Christian, partly because of things that happened in his life, but partly also because Coleridge just shifted his perspective. He talked to Keats before Keats's great moment. Keats, who only lived to be 25, wrote some of the greatest poetry since William Shakespeare. And it hints at faith. It doesn't, he was never a non-believer. He always believed in God, but it started to guide him back to faith. And I talk about how his poetry kind of gives you a glimmer of a promised land he never got to see because he died so young. And Mary Shelley too, who ultimately did become more religious as she grew older. And so all of these people were affected by Coleridge. And so even though they weren't people of faith, they were guided by the faith, and they came back to it, and they just almost rediscovered it. And they didn't quite make it there, but they almost made it there.
I love that you bring up Frankenstein, because you share about your conversion, which of course took place later in your life. And you write that accepting Christ had transformed me into a weirdly peaceful monster, joyful in every little thing. And you talk about how it was literature that really led you to Christ in the first place. So can you share more about this?
Yes, when I was young and I wanted to be a writer, I wanted to study, all the great works, but it actually started out with a personal motive. I didn't have a lot of male role models in my life. And one of the things that all boys need is they need male role models. And I found them in literature. I found them in tough guy detective stories about noble men who went into corrupt areas and stayed clean, even though they had to deal with corruption and murder. The great American detective stories, like the stories of Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, about guys trying to find the truth. And I thought, I want to be like that guy. I want to be a guy who can walk down a mean street and not become mean himself, which is one of the things that Raymond Chandler said about his hero. And in doing that, I started to discover they were all based on kind of mythology and on Arthurian legends. And I became very wrapped up in Arthurian legends. And I started to see that Christ and Christianity was at the center of those. And so really not as a believer at all, but simply as a researcher of what Western culture was about, I started to read the Gospels, which deeply upset my father. We were Jews, and he was very committed to our tradition as Jews, although not to God particularly. And he was very upset when he reading the Gospels, which always makes me laugh because I was 15 years old. I was reading a lot worse stuff than that, but that was the thing that made him angry. And from that, slowly, I began to see that everything I believed, everything I loved, and it took decades. I mean, I was 49 when I was baptized, so it took a long, long time. But that everything that I believed, everything that I knew to be true, and especially the moral web of life that I knew to be true, was wrapped up in Christianity. And at some point, especially after going through personal difficulties and coming out and finding joy, I found personal joy first because I was afraid to embrace Christ when I was in emotional trouble, because I was afraid it would be a crutch and it wouldn't be honest. But after I became joyful, I started to think, now I can trust myself. Now I can trust what I've seen. And since what I've seen is that everything I believe depends on God, at least, I should start to talk to God. And in talking to God over the course of 5 years, I began to realize, oh, I'm a Christian. And so that really was it was certainly an emotional journey. It was certainly a historical journey in my traveling through time, but it was also always deeply a literary journey. And so it didn't surprise me at all when I started to question Christ and say, I don't get what you're saying to me. I don't understand what you're telling me to do. I don't really It's not that I don't care about theology. What I'm really concerned about is, what does Christ want me to do with my life? That's what I wake up thinking about. That's what I pray about. That's what I work on all the time. And so when I said to Christ, I'm not sure I'm getting the message, it didn't surprise me that he sent me back to literature. I mean, I thought that was how I got there. So it wasn't surprising that was how I was going to move more deeply into the Gospels.
I thought it was so interesting how you talk about how the different Gospels talk about Jesus, how no one is really the same, which also makes sense. You wouldn't get the same perspective on one person, from every single person.
Right. Well, exactly. No, that's one of the things that lawyers learn about eyewitnesses, is that if you've got 4 people, they also saw something different. It would be very odd if we had 4 accounts of Jesus's life from 4 different people and they were all exactly the same. This doesn't bother me. This stuff doesn't bother me at all. I mean, I feel that's the part that doesn't bother me about reading the Gospels. I believe that the Gospels, the Bible itself, is God inspired, but it's inspired through people. And people are funny creatures, and they see things in different ways, and they see things sometimes in entirely contradictory ways. And none of that bothers me. That's what I would expect from historical documents, even historical documents that are inspired and are the documents that God means us to have about himself. So that's never worried me. It's like, I know that worries some people, but it doesn't me.
Dan, you talk about how you don't doubt often, but when you do doubt, it's because of it's surrounding the miracles.
What has occasionally, I don't doubt much, because it took me so long to come to faith that I kind of went down every wrong road and found the arguments against every possible mistake you can make. But the miracles trouble me because I'm a scientific person who lives in the scientific age. Things don't work the way the Bible sometimes depicts them as working. You can't just say to somebody, be healed, and have him be healed. That, faith healers almost always turn out to be fakes. Everyone I've ever seen has turned out to be a fake. I make the point that they used to ring bells to chase away lightning because they thought lightning was being thrown by demons, and they thought if they rang church bells, it would go away. And of course, they climbed up into the church tower and they got hit by lightning off the metal bell. So that didn't work very well. Benjamin Franklin's lightning rod worked better. So the miracles trouble me because they take place in a world that's not like the world I know. I know a world that works through science. And I say this having seen miracles, having experienced genuine miracles. I mean, I would not be sitting here today if it weren't for a series of miracles in a lot of different ways. But still, it sometimes makes me think, could that possibly have really happened? What the Romantics did was they showed me how much of what Jesus was doing and what he was saying was based on affecting our consciousness, the way we see the world. So much of it, he says it over and over and again. Those who have ears to hear, let them hear. Those who have eyes to see. In other words, he's trying to show us how he sees the world, and how we can start to see the world like him, and sort of have a little bit of the Jesus mind in us. So he says the joy that is in him will be in us. I mean, that's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful gift to give to somebody, the joy of seeing the world through God's eyes. And again, Jesus says things like, he says, love your enemies. He doesn't say love your enemies because that'll make them nice people. He doesn't say love your enemies because that'll make you a good person. He says, love your enemies because it will make you sons of the Father who treats everyone with mercy and grace, treats everybody the same. And so he said, love your enemies so you can see what God sees. And I have to tell you, when you start to do that, even a little tiny bit, because obviously I'm not a saint, I'm not like a mystic, I'm just a guy doing my job. But even if you see it a little bit, your joy increases exponentially. You suddenly understand, the things that I thought were disappointments aren't disappointments at all. The things that I thought were tragedies have another dimension to them. The things that I expected of the world that didn't come to pass are part of the beauty of the world. And you start to have that, a little bit of that, what Julian of Norwich said, all will be well and all manner of thing will be well. You start to have that wonderful sense that I get it. This world we're in is broken, but the big world is not broken. The big world is working just fine. And that's what I think Jesus was beginning to see. And that's what I think the Romantic poets were moving toward in their pain. And since I'm not Jesus and I'm not a saint, to come to that vision through fallible, pained, and yet brilliantly talented people suits me. It actually works for me in a way and brings me back to the Gospels refreshed, and that's what I'm trying to do. The book is not a book of literary criticism. It's a book of stories. It's a book of these guys lived such interesting lives. They had such interesting conversations, such interesting things happened to them, that I just kind of tell the stories of their lives and talk about the poetry at the same time, because I just think I want people who are not English majors, who are not necessarily even poetry fans, to see what this kind of art can do and how it can enlarge your vision of things.
You must have had such an empathy for these poets, really digging into their lives and getting so familiar with their pain.
Yeah, it is funny. I've lived with them my whole life, and especially Wordsworth and Keats. I have a kind of very special emotional relationship to them both. When I was a young man, Keats just seemed to speak right into my heart, almost like an arrow into my heart. And as I grew older, and as I sort of shifted both my political and my religious beliefs, Wordsworth went through this move from being a radical to being hated as a conservative, even though he was always very a guy who loved liberty and wanted more people to be free. And as he became a Christian as well, he kind of lived a little bit of that passage of my life. And so these are guys that I have lived with a long time. I have frequently felt that if there's ever a clerical error and somehow I get into heaven, Keats may be the first person I see, because he knows how I've loved his work so much. And so, it was funny. I had this dream. I talk about this in the book. I had this dream that when I wrote this book, I would get to go back to England, where I lived for many years, get to visit Keats's house and Wordsworth's house again, all places I've been before, maybe talk to some of the scholars. But then COVID hit and we were locked down. And I realized that if I was going to get this book written, I better sit down and write it. And so I ended up writing it in a tiny little outhouse of a workshop that I had in when I was still in California, with my books, a lifetime's collection of books just piled up around me in this tremendous mess. I was glad my wife never came in, because she would have just thought that something had exploded, and it was very much me and them, instead of being about traveling, instead of being about experts, it was very much just me and them after a lifetime of knowing one another, coming back into that world. And that's what I try to bring to life in the book. The fact that these guys were hilarious. They were, zany. They were troubled. They were in pain. They were human. And yet out of that humanity came this genius that actually reinvented the consciousness of Western man. And I think that, that's the story I try to tell.
Yeah. So what is the lesson that we can learn today from the way that the Romantics saw the world?
I think the lesson, the thing that I saw, is because these guys, many of them, were not believers when they wrote their best poetry. And Coleridge was the big exception because he was the smartest of them all. That they looked at nature, just not God, not heaven, just nature. And somehow Christian truth looked back at them. And I think Coleridge, of all of them, saw that even if Jesus had never been born, even if he had never been crucified and resurrected, even if that had never happened in history, the truth of who he was would still be invested in nature. And this is why most of the great Christian thinkers from the very beginning have always said there's a book of scripture and there's a book of nature. And in both of them, we can read the glory of God. And they always said these things actually are telling the same story. And the Romantics proved that to be true. And so I think that what you learn from this, I think, is don't be afraid. Jesus is always saying this, don't be afraid. He said, I think there's one part where he's walking on water and they think he's a ghost. And he says, don't be afraid, it's me. And I think that that's what nature says to us all the time. Don't be afraid, it's me. I am that I am. And I'm even in the lightning and the thunder and the disease and the death and the real terrible things that happen. He's there, he's speaking to you out of this matter. And I think that what they rediscovered in an age when science was making faith shaky, what they rediscovered is that matter, this stuff that we're made out of, is the language in which God speaks to us. And the world in which the world of the supernatural is this world. It's not a fantasy world. It's not a world we have to believe, a million impossible things a day. It's just living in this world with the intensity and presence and wisdom to see what's actually there right in front of you. And that's what I think the poets teach us.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for chatting with me. I really enjoyed the book, and I know a lot of other people will too. So I really
Thanks so
appreciate it.
much. It's been great talking to you. I appreciate it.